Well, hello, and welcome to the PGH Writing Command Center for another podcast episode from God Bless the Cake Publishing, LLC. Oh, I love this music. We have all kinds of music going on today. We got a new intro music there. I might use it as an outro, too, but thanks to Break Z Studio for the upbeat intro music. Check them out. They have lots of offerings, lots of cool stuff on Pixabay, pixabay.com, Break Z Studio. Thank you for the cool, upbeat intro music. And we are gathered here at the PGH Writing Command Center, and welcome. I am John Hausleben of God Bless the Cake Publishing, LLC, and I am the flagship author, chief photographer, chief cook, bottle washer, music reviewer, music critic, and do everything guy here at God Bless the Cake Publishing with a little help from my friends. Some of my friends are gathered here today. They're fairly well behaved. 2 or 3 of them got into my beer in the refrigerator, and they're a little unruly. And now they're eating potato chips over there and dropping all the little bits and bobs all over the floor. But hey, you guys, you gotta need to clean all that stuff up, you know? What are you laughing at? At any rate, we're thrilled you're here today, and thanks for joining us on the podcast. If you are a repeat listener, then welcome back. If this is your first time tuning into the podcast to this crazy New Jersey guy, well then, welcome. And we have a special subject here. I'm very excited to talk about it, so we're going to get into that. And I'm going to call it the magic of radio. And we're going to have part 1 here today because I can talk about radio quite a bit. And we'll get into that. But we've got all kinds of other things going on here. And if you would like to sponsor the podcast, send us a little email to godblessthecakepublishing@gmail.com. godblessthecakepublishing@gmail.com. We'll be sure to check you out and help you out. And also, if you have a charity or you have a goodwill event, some kind of, I know the holidays are coming, some kind of, a Christmas fair or Halloween fair or the Halloween parade or something, just send me an email at godblessthecakepublishing@gmail.com, and we'll be sure to mention it here on the old podcast, Arooski, for you. So before we get into the meat and potatoes, let's get our little Orphan Annie decoder pins out. And this podcast is proudly sponsored by Corporate Facilities Group Incorporated, the leader in technical consulting, facility maintenance, facility management and operations, as well as property maintenance and management services throughout America. And now CFG Incorporated is proud to announce a new department, a new initiative, headed up by the amazing Steve McMillan. Let's put the potato chips down and give it up for Steve here. Yeah, Steve brings as many years of experience as he manages pre-construction services and estimating for your residential development projects, residential renovations, and light commercial projects for CFG Incorporated. Hey, before you spend big bucks on a project, let old Steve Arooski check out the contractor scope and price and make sure your hard-earned money is going in the right place. Don't get snookered. Don't get snookered out there. Give Steve a call. He'll take care of you. Tell him Paulie sent you. Check them out on the web at www.corporatefacilitiesgroupfigure1.com. That's www.corporatefacilitiesgroupfigure1.com. You can also click on the little link koozie in the podcast episode website, and the magic of the internet will take you to the CFG website. And thank you to Lydia, Steve, Liliana, and all the good folks at CFG Incorporated for sponsoring the podcast. We thank you very much. And I'd like to give a little shout out today to Haley. Haley the server, the remarkable, amazing Haley over at Rare Old Times Irish Pub at Canterbury Shopping Center in Henrico, Virginia. If you're in the Henrico, Virginia, the greater Richmond area, check them out. It's a great place. And Haley's she's a blast. She waited on us the other night and served. We had an unruly meeting. I was at a business meeting, and I found out that one of the guys who was peddling stuff was a Red Sox fan. And it was during the Yankee-Red Sox playoff game. He almost didn't get the sale, but Haley refereed, and she listens to the podcast. And she particularly thinks I'm a crabby old man because of the Pet Peeve podcast. And she might be right. I got accused of being a grumpy old man because of that podcast. And I'm going to add a little fuel to the Pet Peeve podcast fire, because I'm going to mention another pet peeve I have. It just happened to me this week when they move the food store aisles around. The managers, they get pressure from the big executives to come and they tour around the store. And they're like, you got to put the bread over here. Make them walk past all the impulse items. See, I know all the schnookering tricks these grocery markets do. And they change stuff around. They put the beer aisle a little different, too. They put the regular beer guys on one side. And then where the classic beers, the craft beers, the expensive stuff that Paulie can't afford. And they flip-flopped them. So I went for my regular, drain pour beer, and there's all fancy beers there. And I was like, what's going on here? And I realized they moved the food store aisles around. So that's a pet peeve. I'm going to mention that. Moving the food store aisles. Just leave it the way it has been for 10 years. And I have this other thing I'm going to make a shout out. Absurd AI articles. And you can tell these articles are generated by artificial intelligence. Most of the time, they don't make any sense. The wording don't make any sense. And it's all discombobulated. And sometimes the subjects are so outrageous. So this is a shout out to the most absurd AI news article that Paulie came across this week. Toilet paper is going to be obsolete. And I'm not going to get into the graphic details of what's replacing toilet tissue. But the most absurd the most absurd part of this article was that it said a standard in households and I can't even say it. A standard throughout the world has been to use toilet paper for a few decades. Well, I don't know about you guys out there, but I'm kind of old, and I've used toilet paper for more than just like a few decades. And as far as I know, my mother, my grandfather, my grandmother, and generations of my family have used toilet paper. These articles, they're so absurd, it's a riot. But at any rate, I'm babbling too much here. So to get into the meat and potatoes, so this is the magic of radio. And I'm going to, I got to rattle some stuff in the background for dramatic effect. So here's a sound. Yep. And I'm tuning a radio dial. Static. I just love it. Because for me, I never knew what was going to come up as I tuned the dial on the radio. And that's the magic of it. And ever since I was a little boy, I'd say 8 years old, I was the classic kid with the transistor radio thing hidden behind your pillow on the bed. And I was very, very lucky to grow up in the era that I did, and in the location I did too, because in the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut area, and even South Jersey towards Philly, and I guess if you lived over in the Scranton area in Pennsylvania, the Poconos, in that greater area, I think that I'm going to be a little biased, a little prejudiced, and say that I was subject to the greatest radio listening that I possibly could have had. And that's not only with sports. I mean, think about it. We had, the Jets, the Giants, the Yankees, the Mets. My old man had the Dodgers and the Giants and the Yankees. And then you had the Rangers and the Devils and the Islanders, and a little bit to the south, if the propagation was right, you could pick up WCAU, in Philadelphia with the great Gene Hart doing the Flyer broadcasts. And then you could maybe pick up Hartford with the Whalers. And you just can't imagine how wonderful all these radio stations were, and in some cases are still around. And I've got a list of them. But I was the classic little kid, and my mother and father would say, all right, Paulie, go to bed now. No listen to the radio. And, of course, you turn on the radio, and I hid it behind my pillow. And that's where I fell in love with radio, tuning that radio dial. Because on a cold winter night, January, February, even December, around Christmas time, you tune in Christmas music, and the air was clear on the AM band, and the propagation would allow these stations from far away to come booming in. I mean, I can remember tuning in and hearing Toronto Maple Leaf games from Ontario province, and the Midwest with the Chicago Blackhawks. And if the propagation was really right, the Boston station would boom in loud and clear with Bruins. Of course, we were rooting against the Bruins. Any team that plays the Bruins, I'm rooting for that team. And the magic of radio, I just was always fascinated. And I guess it started for me Christmas with my dad and my mom. Santa Claus brought me a crystal radio kit. And my dad, I was probably about 8, maybe I was 7 or 8. And I wrote a story about this. It's in, oh my goodness, the Christmas collection, Reflections, the Christmas collection, called The Radio. And then we built this shortwave radio kit a couple of Christmases later, and I just fell in love with the magic of radio. The antenna up in the air. We put the copper wire up, and, how does the signal go through the air? In the air, there's all this mysterious, magical stuff. And the radio waves are all around you, and you just need the proper thing to capture them. And you can tune in the hockey games and the baseball games and the music and the news. And it just fascinated me. So my earliest memories of how great the music scene was, and what helped spawn my love of music, came with the great radio stations coming out of New York City at that time. And we'll get into a couple of those call signs and the magic of that. But I even to this day, my greatest love is listening to the radio. Aside from my ham radio and military radio and the other things that I've done, obviously I love the ham radio, and I've done a couple ham radio podcasts and YouTube on our YouTube channel about my radio hobby. But for me, I listen to almost all my sports on the radio. And now I tune in mostly on the satellite radio. I might stream something. But I still tune in on, the regular AM, FM. If I can pick up the stations. There's just something about it. I don't mind the fading of the signal, and I have a hard time concentrating on television sports. I'll be honest with you. The only sport I really, 2 sports I guess I enjoy. I'm primarily a hockey fan. Ice hockey's my first love. And I do like watching the hockey games on the TV. And I only have a little tiny TV. I only bought it last Christmas. People laugh at me. The writing command center is very sparsely furnished. And I love watching football, as Americans tend to call it, soccer. And I watch my Nottingham Forest on the TV because I enjoy watching the setups and the movement of the players, very similar to hockey. Now, American football and baseball, that's got to be on the radio. It's got to be a backdrop. It has to be the noise in the background. And I find American football atrociously boring. I just can't get. Part of it is because I'm a Jets fan. yeah, I'm a a beleaguered Jets fan, but I just find it atrociously boring. They've ruined the sport, absolutely ruined it. penalty after penalty and flag after flag. It's gotten to the point where the broadcasters, the announcers, the play-by-play guy will say, it's a 20-yard pass over the middle, caught by Henderson. He's down at the 15. No flags. And you can tell their head is going up and down the field trying to see if there's any penalties. It's just... And then they have a commercial, and it's the scoreboard, sponsored by CFG Incorporated. And it's endless talk about nothing. I read somewhere where out of a whole football game, there's like 13 minutes of action. Isn't that amazing? That's amazing, but I digress. So I have to watch soccer, football on the TV, and hockey. And I'll listen to those games on the radio, too. But primarily, I'm a radio listener, and that's how I get my sports. I get my little bit of news. I try to stay away from the news because, Paulie, I'm pushing the big executives at God Bless the Cake Publishing LLC to come up with the good news channel because I want a channel that just broadcasts good news. I'm tired of all this other stuff, politics in particular. All they do is fight. But anyway, so the first thing, on a weekend, if I'm home, the radio goes on right away. That's like it. I get my tea, my coffee, my little breakfast, whatever. The radio has to go on. And I even when I'm writing, I even have music in the radio going on. So it's just been a big part of my life. And to get back to how lucky I was in New York and New Jersey and Connecticut, growing up in Paterson, about 30 miles west of New York City. And some of the transmitters were right there in the Meadowlands, in the swampy areas on the medium wave. And you could put the big towers. If you went down Route 3, Route 17, Route 46, I know when you got off of Route 3 and you turned onto the Parkway, you could see the big giant towers out of the ground for the famous station Whiskey Papa Alpha Tango, WPAT, in Paterson, which was a very famous 93 on the AM dial and 93.1 on the FM dial. A very, very famous, easy listening radio station, WPAT in Paterson. And WHN, the old WHN transmitter, was down in the Meadowlands, and it's just fascinated me to the point where I actually sat in the old days and passed the FCC radio telephone license examination, which was incredibly hard. It had a lot of algebra and trigonometry, and I'm not too good at that math stuff. And I passed and got my license because I was only about 19, maybe 20. In addition to my ham radio license, I wanted to be the chief engineer at a radio station and fix these guys. Now I don't think you even need that license. I don't even know where it is. But at any rate, fascination. And some of the classic radio stations, so you guys that might have grown up in, the area, WHN, the old 3-letter call sign, which I believe is gone, Whiskey Hotel November. Oh gosh, that was up on the AM dial. It wasn't at 7. It was 880 maybe, 880 on the AM dial. Then you had the great WOR, which is still around, and WOR was 710 on the AM dial. I think it's still 710. And that was a station that had so many memories for me because it was my dear mom's favorite radio station. And she would turn that on early in the morning. And it was this show that was on for years, Rambling with Gambling, with John Gambling, who took over from, I believe, his grandfather, and his grandfather started. At any rate, it was a long time in the family. John Gambling, and it was called Rambling with Gambling, and he just would babble about a bunch of early morning stuff, the news, the sports, and things like that. Every once in a while, he would play a little music, but not too often. And my mother, as we were getting ready for school, dear mom would put the WOR on, and they had these classic lineup of announcers. They had Don Criqui, who was the sports guy. And this is the old days. They had the traffic helicopter. And they had this helicopter 710. That's it. Helicopter 710. And they would go for these live traffic reports. And Freddie Feldman, that was the guy's name that piloted the helicopter 710 around New York City. And, you know, traffic's backed up on the West Side Highway. The Cross Bronx a mess. The GW Bridge is a mess. Blah, blah, blah. You ought to go home. Just don't even try to get in the city. It's a disaster. And Freddie Feldman would fly around in the helicopter. And as a little kid, this is how my sister and I, you know, we grew up early in the morning. Listen to this. And I believe that the Rambling with Gambling program was on for like 90 some years. It started on radio in New York City. It's absolutely fascinating. And just a few years back, it might be more than a few years back, John Gambling's son finally retired. And the show finally faded away after all those years. But one of the great memories of anybody who grew up in that area was on a snowy day, listening to John Gambling read the school closure list. And there you were as a little kid praying, just praying that, for me, at first it was Patterson Public Schools are closed. You know, he'd be going through it. It's like alphabetical. Passaic High School, Patterson Public Schools. And he would just go through it alphabetically. And then, of course, Haledon Public Schools when we moved over to the borough of Haledon. And there you were, like a little kid just sitting on a hot tin plate on the edge of your seat, praying that John Gambling says Haledon Public Schools are closed. But he would read the school closure list. And as boring as it sounds, even after you cheer and you're jumping all around and cheering that your school is closed. Yeah, school is closed today. You'd still listen to him read the rest of the the school's closed. It was fascinating because it was like a lesson in geography. And then you get to the parochial school, Sacred Heart, and DePaul, and Don Bosco Tech, Don Bosco Prep. You just go through all these schools. And it also had the classic lineup of great radio personalities. These are legends. WOR had legends. Arlene Francis, I think it is, and she had WOR had the great Bob Grant in the afternoon, one of the first ranting, raving, conservative radio hosts. He'd always call politicians fake, phony frauds. Yeah, he'd call them fake, phony, fraudulent. He was a character and just amassed a huge popularity and listening audience. And then you had, I think it was Joe Franklin. Oh, gosh, I'm trying to remember all these names. It's and, of course, in the Long John Nebel. Now, that was a radio personality. He came on later in his life and became a radio personality. What an interesting guy. But he hosted a show that was like UFOs and psychics and weird and strange events and the unexplained on the radio. And I would tune him in, and he married this very beautiful woman, Candy something or other. Candy Jones, maybe. She was like a pinup model. And Long John Nebel was a tall, lanky, skinny guy. And he hosted this. It was fascinating, some of the subjects. And his wife, Candy, would claim to have been kidnapped by, crazy government agents. And they brainwashed her and did all this wackadoodle stuff. And, he'd interview his wife, and she'd go under hypnosis, and she'd recount all these adventures. And and I guess all the other stations and radio personalities that competed with him. There was Coast to Coast, right? Coast to Coast with he was a ham radio operator. Can't think of his name. And I think Coast to Coast is still on late at night. And fascinating shows that probably should give credit to Long John Nebel because he plowed the road for these guys to be successful later on. Just like Bob Grant kind of plowed the road for like Hannity and these other conservative radio guys who branched out into all kinds of media. So WOR 710 on the AM dial is a historic radio station. And I was lucky enough to listen. But the creme de la creme, the best of the best, the most wonderful on WOR was the great Gene Shepard. And old Shep, I've mentioned many times on the show, Kilo 2, Oscar Romeo Sierra, was a radio man through and through. So, like Paulie, I guess the radio was in his blood. He served in the Signal Corps in the Army and just grew up in radio. And Shep was the best. And he came on, I want to say he had an unusual time slot. It was only weekdays. I think it was 9:15 to 10 o'clock. And he would only have one or two commercials during his whole broadcast. It was like Lifebuoy soap and somebody else who would sponsor him. And he tried to zip through those commercials really quick. And all he did was tell stories. I don't ever remember the great Gene Shepard. He was a true raconteur, just a storyteller, and a great influence on me. And he would just tell stories. And the subject could have been army stories or absurd stories or whatever. He was a humorist, and he loved to laugh. And he was just a legend. He could start these stories, and I know the feeling, go off in a totally different direction. And then somehow, maybe 5 minutes before the end of the radio station, he would sum it all up and get back to the main subject and wrap it all up just as he went off the air. And I read later on, I'm a huge Shepard fan, so I read a lot about him. And his engineer would marvel how he could just go on and on and on with no notes, no reference, just a stream of consciousness. So definitely a mentor for me, and wrote some great books, short stories mostly. So I have a great appreciation for his humor. And I have to admit, he's a huge mentor for me. And Ferrari in the Bedroom, Wanda Hickey's Night of Golden Memories, In God We Trust, All Others Pay Cash. That's some of the books he wrote. And, of course, The Christmas Story. Most folks know Gene Shepard, from The Christmas Story, even if you didn't grow up listening to his radio station broadcasts on WOR. And A Christmas Story, the BB gun, the kid who wants a BB gun for Christmas. And Shep narrates that. He's narrating the story. And that's actually a cobbled together of a bunch of short stories. The BB gun, I think it was Red Ryder Rides Again, is the primary story. But Shep introduced me as reading all his short stories and books and listening to his radio station as a kid and a young man. I could tell this cobbled together with a lot of different stories from his different books. Christmas Story, just a fabulous, and of course I make a reference to it most every podcast with the little orphan Annie decoder pin. It's a crummy commercial. I'm sure if you don't know that, if you go on the big video, you'll of course see that little excerpt. But Shepard, a huge influence on me, and just an amazing mind. Funny, intelligent, hilarious, really. And I got the great pleasure. He used to come on for you ham guys out there, 2 meters early in the morning and hit a repeater, and as we were all going to work. And every once in a while he'd bump on a repeater, and I worked him one morning on the way into work. Great memory for me, but just an amazing radio man, Gene Shepard on WOR radio. And he also hosted, he was like in the smoky nightclubs, there was this, and I'm not sure what the nightclub was. It was a cocktail lounge with stand-up comedians and hosts. I think it was the Limelight. And I want to say the Limelight was in Greenwich Village. And old Shep would show up at the Limelight at least a couple times a month. I never caught his show there, and that's a great regret. I was a little too young. I probably couldn't even have snuck in. But check out Gene Shepard. He's all over the place. So WOR, a legendary radio station. And then we had, over on the FM dial, we had WPLJ, Whiskey Papa Lima Juliet. And that was rock and roll, just rock and roll with the famous Jim Kerr, was one of the most popular DJs. And they just had a great format. They were commercials, but they weren't atrocious. And Jim Kerr would play classic rock and some modern hits and things like that. I want to say PLJ just went off the air a couple of years ago. And I mentioned WPAT's transmitters. They would transmit at Christmas. It would start on Christmas Eve right through Christmas Day up until midnight. Continuous Christmas music. And this was the old Christmas music, the golden age of Christmas music. Percy Faith and some of the old Felix Slack and, all these old golden age recordings, Montavani. And it was called The Spirit of Christmas. And it had no commercial interruptions except at the top of the hour. There was a quick little blurb. This hour is sponsored by Corporate Facilities Group Incorporated. And that was about it, And then they'd go into the Christmas music. So my old man would always look forward to WPAT's The Spirit of Christmas show. And he'd flip it on. I think it started Christmas Eve at 6 o'clock in the afternoon. And some of the other radio stations, Light FM over in New York City, can't remember where they were on the dial. I think they're still there. And WPLJ would have a Christmas. I can go on, and I'll leave it for part 2. But by far, other than WOR, with all the memories of talk people, on John Neville and Arlene Francis and Shep, as far as music goes, for me, what introduced me to the love of progressive rock, classic rock, all these amazing music artists that you wouldn't ordinarily hear, like on WABC with 77 WABC with Cousin Brucey, a famous DJ, but they're just playing like bubblegum top 40 pop hits. And that's okay. That was fun. But really, I learned that I loved more intricate, more in-depth music from the great WNEW 102.7 on the FM dial, where rock lives. And this was the greatest radio station for music ever assembled. And this was free play where the DJs, and I know there was a big thing with payola, and DJs were allowed to just spin whatever records they wanted, and then everything gets crazy. They'd slip them a few bucks and they'd push 1 or 2 records. And I think it went all the way to Congress, and they tried to stop free play DJs and all that. And they set to a set list, but it didn't affect WNEW at all. And their DJs were it's the greatest lineup of DJs of all time. And I mean, I can remember listening to WNEW FM and the Beatles, John and Paul and Ringo and George, they show up in the studio to shoot the breeze when they're in New York City. I can remember a Yes concert. It was at the old Roosevelt Stadium in Jersey City, when Yes released the Relayer album. And it was broadcast live over WNEW FM. I mean, the unheard of things that they plowed the road. And these DJs could just spin what they wanted to. The executives then get involved, and they would have live, like I said, live artists would come in just to shoot the breeze and hang out in the station. It was amazing. But I'm going to read a lineup here. I wrote it down, of the DJs that hosted and had gigs on WNEW FM. Scott Muni, they called him the Professor, a gravelly voice, kind of growled in the microphone. He was fabulous. And they called him the Professor because of his incredible knowledge of music. People say, hey, Paulie, you know a lot about music. My fingertip doesn't have the knowledge that Scott Muni had. And my buddy Jeff, I call him the musical encyclopedia. Jeff might be able to go head-to-head with the old Scott Muni, but Dave Herman, Pete Fornatale, Carol Miller, who I believe is still on radio in New York City. I want to say Carol Miller also shows up on some of the classic rock stations on the satellite radio, too. Carol Miller, she dated a lot of rock stars, a very pretty woman. Meg Griffin, I think she's still on. The great Jonathan Schwartz, who for a long time not only dabbled in progressive rock, but he also had the Saturday with Sinatra, hosted by Jonathan Schwartz. He was a big golden age of music guy, as well as prog rock. And he had a syndicated show, I think, for years and years, Saturday with Sinatra, where on Saturday night he would play Sinatra cuts. William B. Williams, Dennis Elsis, Richard Gere, and my favorite, and every male in New Jersey, New York, Connecticut's favorite, was to stay up late for Allison Steele, the Nightbird. She came on very late. I think she took the graveyard shift. Might have been 11 to 6 or 11 to 5 or 12 to 7. I don't know, but she came on. She was the Nightbird. And she had the most sexy, sultry voice you could ever imagine. The woman's voice could melt your radio speaker. And she would read spacey poetry, and she would kind of breathe into the microphone and set your hormones on fire. She was amazing. Allison Steele, the Nightbird, and she would play a lot of really, really unusual prog rock cuts. She was a huge Renaissance fan, and I love Renaissance. And she would often open the show with Prologue, which is a famous Renaissance cut from their first album title track, Prologue. And she'd play deep tracks from Focus, Fairport Convention, a lot of prog rock, Tull, a lot of deep cuts from Jethro Tull. And she played the Beatles, and she played Zeppelin a little bit. But most of the time she played, and they would play these long cuts. She played like South Side of the Sky from the Fragile album. Yes, I mean, you're talking 10-minute cuts. They didn't care. They just played what they played. And that kind of radio is what I really miss. And people often ask me, do I think, terrestrial radio is dead? And I don't think so. There's still a lot of independent stations out there. Not to the extent that, your Clear Channel, your 50,000 kilowatt stations that just bomb. No matter where they broadcast, they bomb in. They're owned by the big giant corporations, and that's all ruined. I mean, it's just endless commercials or syndicated shows, no real DJ, so to speak, anymore. That corporate stuff is just ruined radio. But if you tune around, there are some independents. And I think it was in Christmas Cocktails, the book I wrote of short stories, and it's something static, and I can't, it's a shame I wrote so many stories I can't remember them, but it's about an old DJ who was a free-form, free-play DJ and could play whatever he wanted, and he got old and got a drinking problem, and marriage broke up and all that heartache stuff, and it comes up around Christmas time. And he used to do this Christmas show, and he starts writing letters to little independent radio stations. And he had a golden voice, and he knew that he could just get back on the air, and his old format would be successful, even in this modern day and age. And he included a little demo tape, a little cassette tape with each of his mailings. And of course he gets rejected and nobody answers, and it gets frustrating until finally a little tiny low power radio station out in the middle of nowhere in New Jersey. And this is all fiction, of course. The radio station can't get sponsors, and they're about to fold up. And he says, I remember this guy, the owner of the radio station. He says, I remember this guy. He was a legend years ago on the radio in New York City. And he gives him a shout, and he gives him a gig on this little radio station. And of course, he's a raging success. And I have to think if it worked years ago, it would still work nowadays. And, I know prog rock is not everybody's favorite format, but gosh, for us that grew up listening to WNEW-FM, it just opened up a whole new world for me. And I thank them, all those great DJs and the folks behind that concept. And it's very sad that it's gone away. Very, very sad. But you still have good independent stations. You got to tune for them. And I'm going to advocate a little for shortwave, particularly WRMI, Whiskey Romeo Mike India, out of Okeechobee, Florida. Very powerful radio station. And they have a very, very a wonderful assortment of programs. And yes, I listen mostly on 5 megahertz. It's sometimes on the 7 megahertz. They have different channels, different frequencies they broadcast on. So you got to know a little bit about propagation to have a decent radio. I don't have a big antenna for that. I just have a little telescoping antenna, and it comes in quite well at night. And they have just a unique collection. It's not only the fire and brimstone radio preachers that are up and down shortwave, and certainly there are a few of those, but they have some other really cool stations on there that play some music, play oldies, old rock and roll, and Saturday night, Sunday night. They have some classical music on Sunday night. They got the talk show conspiracy theories guys like Hal Turner. And then there's a really good guy. He's a preacher, but he doesn't get into the religion too much. He's mostly just talking about events. Bob Bierman. So there are really good independents out there and good radio program that still exists. And it's fascinating. So for me, growing up and all these memories and the magic of radio, I feel sadness, but I feel exhilaration that I experience. I'm sad that it no longer exists in the way, shape, or form. You got to dig under the surface. And for me, there's nothing. Well, it's changed now, so I shouldn't say that. But tuning in a New York Yankees radio broadcast on the New York Yankees radio network. And John Sterling, the great John Sterling, is retired now, and they have Dave Sims. And I'm warming up to Dave Sims. I got to get used to it. And John Sterling was around forever. The great Susan Wallman's still on there. And it's just magical for me to tune in. And the Jets stink, but I enjoy Bob Wischusen, and it used to be Marty Lyons. Now it's Anthony Beck. And all these great announcers, the great Sam Rosen. And we'll talk about some other the great sports announcers, because I'm blabbed a lot and I'm running out of time here. But the magic of radio part 1, I hope I shared some memories for you folks that might have grown up there, or if I didn't, and you didn't grow up there and you want to research some of these things, check it out. WNEW-FM or Rock Lives and WOR and the great Gene Shepard and everything I mentioned, because it's just a big part of my life. But we really enjoyed talking about radio, and hey, practice some kindness out there. Be kind, be tolerant, be gentle. Kindness is for free. You can spread it around in the world, and the more that you do, the world becomes a better place. But thank you for tuning in, and we'll come up with part 2 of the magic of radio. Maybe talk about some shortwave more, and some ham radio, and some of those other things. And now I got to clean up the floor and get these people out of here. Yeah. So, hey, we will see you next time. And let me see if I can push the right buttons here, and I can get this cool outro music going. And hey, we'll see you next time. And I'm just a guy from Paterson, New Jersey. And in tuning in to radio, I'm just thrilled that I was lucky enough to have grown up in Paterson. Hey, thanks. Bye-bye. We'll see you next time.